So the table saw is one of the most useful tools in the woodworking shop, and these smaller job site saws are a really great choice for people with smaller spaces because when you're done using them, you can roll them up against the wall and get them out of your way. That said, this small size is also one of the biggest weaknesses, and that small size can make using these saws pretty awkward and sometimes kind of dangerous. So I've been working on some projects using this job site saw as part of my new course, Jumpstart Your Woodworking. And along the way, I've built a couple different jigs to make working with this table saw a little easier. And I figured I'd go ahead and show those off in this video. So let's go ahead and jump right in with jig number 1. Oh, and PS, none of the jigs are crosscut sled. So cross-cutting panels on a table saw this size can be a little bit tricky, especially if you're trying to just square up one edge, because you can't really just run an edge up against the fence if it's not square. So how do you square up a panel like this on a saw this size? Because if you try to use something like a miter gauge, you will very quickly run out of room. As you can see, the table depth on the saw like this is much shorter than on a larger cabinet saw. And as soon as that miter gauge isn't contacting the table, it's gonna get super tippy. And obviously this doesn't really work to square anything up. And you could also consider building a crosscut sled, which is the route a lot of people go, but to build a crosscut sled big enough to cut even this size of panel, which honestly is not very big, you would have to have a pretty monstrous sled. And the problem with sleds that size are that they get really heavy and hard to move around. And I know in my case, that means I'm gonna be a lot less likely to use them. And that's where something like this panel sled comes into play. So as you can see, this works similarly to a crosscut sled. You have a fence. In this case, the fence is at the front. You could definitely put it at the back as well, but this is a very simple jig. It's made out of a piece of 1/2-inch plywood for the base to keep the weight down. I used a piece of scrap pre-finished plywood that I had on hand, so the jig slides really nice and easily. As you'll see, the miter bar is just made out of a piece of 3/4-inch plywood, and then the fence is another piece of 3/4-inch plywood. So I'm guessing most of you guys have all of the materials you need on hand to make one of these, but you can see the beauty of this jig is that with these longer runners, you can slide your workpiece way back, clear of the blade, and then very easily square up a panel up to probably about 2 feet deep with no issues. And this jig was popularized by the woodworking goat himself, Norm Abram from New Yankee Workshop. He did an entire episode about jigs back in the day, and this was one of the ones he featured, and I think it's a really great design. So let's see exactly how I built this thing. So I started with the runners, which again are made out of some scraps of 3/4-inch Baltic birch plywood. And the first step was to rip down some strips to fit in these miter slots. Now this fit needs to be pretty dead on accurate. You want a really snug fit in your miter slots so you don't have any play in the finished jig. Now I'll say that I personally prefer buying metal miter bars. I think they're a lot easier to dial in, but unfortunately the miter bars I had on hand were a little bit short for this application because as you can see, these runners extend past the front and back edges of the sled, and that's so that you still have a nice reference point when the sled is all the way back here behind the blade, as well as when the sled is past the blade. But anyway, once I got the width of the runners dialed in, I went ahead and ripped the thickness in half. And as it turns out, ripping a piece of 3/4-inch plywood along its thickness gives you 2 perfect runners. So this is definitely a great way to make runners. Plywood's gonna be a lot more dimensionally stable than something like hardwood. Another great material choice would be UHMW plastic, which is what a lot of cutting boards are made out of. So if you can find some longer cutting boards, you can rip those down into strips as well. Once the runners were ripped down, I went ahead and added some washers into the miter slots to raise the runners up because otherwise they would have been below the surface of the table. And then I added a bead of CA glue and glued the panel into place, bumping it up against the fence to get the panel at least pretty square. And I should mention that I'll have the dimensions for all these jigs available in a free downloadable PDF for you guys to check out. Obviously, you might need to adjust some of these dimensions and they might not be the best dimensions. I just used pieces of scrap that I had on hand, but they seem to work out pretty well. Once the glue dried, I reinforced the connection with some screws and I made sure to pre-drill and countersink those holes so that those screws don't protrude past the bottom of the runners, which could potentially scratch up my table saw. And then I could move on to adding the fence. Before adding the fence, I went ahead and added a little chamfer to the bottom edge, and that'll just keep any bits of sawdust from throwing off the squareness of the fence. And after adding that chamfer, I went ahead and clamped the fence in place and screwed it down on one end, again pre-drilling and countersinking that hole. Next, I squared up the fence with the panel, but realistically, I probably should have squared it up with the table saw blade in this case. Didn't really matter that much because I was gonna be double checking the squareness with the 5-cut method. But after getting the fence attached on that other side, I went ahead and ran the sled through the blade to cut it off flush. Next, I could test the sled for square by squaring up one end of a panel, and it was honestly pretty darn square right off the bat. I probably could have left it, but I figured why not go ahead and show you guys how to do the 5-cut method with this style of sled, in case you want to get your sled dialed into NASA levels of accuracy. So in case you've never heard of the 5-cut method, it's a technique popularized by William Ng, and the process is pretty simple. You take a panel, make a cut on each edge of the panel, rotating the panel after each cut so that that freshly cut edge is up against the fence. And this process of rotating the panel after each cut compounds any error in the fence of your sled, and then after making the 5th cut, you can measure the 2 ends of that strip and do some math to figure out how out of whack your fence is. So thankfully, my buddy Jonathan Katz-Moses has a calculator for this on his website, and so I plugged in the numbers for my fence, and as it turned out, I only needed to move my fence less than a 32nd of an inch to get it squared up. So again, I don't really know if it was worth messing with, but I figured I'd go ahead and show you the process in case you want to do it. So when you're working with numbers this small, it really helps to have some sort of reference point. So what I did was go ahead and clamp down a block next to the fence equal to the distance I needed to move the fence. That way, all I needed to do to make the adjustment was unscrew the fence, bump it over up against my reference block, clamp the fence back down, and then drill a new hole to reattach the fence. Because if I tried to drive the screw into that old hole, it would have had the tendency to shift the fence back to where it was, which would obviously defeat the purpose of doing all this. So after adjusting my fence, I went ahead and repeated that 5-cut method, and unfortunately, as it turned out, I moved the fence in the wrong direction. So what I didn't realize is that the calculator on the Katz-Moses website is meant for a standard crosscut sled, which has the fence at the front. In my case, the fence is at the back, so I needed to move the fence in the opposite direction the calculator was telling me to. So I went ahead and did that, again using that reference block, and then I could go through the 5-cut method one last time to double check everything, and thankfully the fence was dead on at that point. So with the fence dialed in, I could go ahead and add a bunch more screws to reinforce the fence. And with that, the sled was pretty much done. I think the only other thing I might add is some of this peel and stick kind of grip tape, because since this panel is pre-finished plywood, it's pretty darn slick, which on the bottom is great, but on the top, that could maybe lead to the panel moving around during the cutting process, but I guess we'll see. Another thing you might have noticed is that I ended up adding a little bit of painter's tape to the edge of one of my runners, and that was just to further dial in the fit in this miter slot. And I might even add another piece of painter's tape because it's pretty solid, but there's just a tiny bit of play here. So again, I would recommend these metal runners, but that's up to you. So that's jig number 1 covered. Let's move on to jig number 2. Let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Incogni. So, have you ever tried Googling yourself? Put in your full name, your city, and state into a Google search bar, and I think you'll be shocked at how much of your information is out there on the internet for anyone to find. So most of the sites with this information are data brokers, and data brokers are companies that gather personal information and then sell that information for a profit. They usually scan the web for details like names, addresses, phone numbers, social media accounts, and even things like court records, real estate listings, and social security numbers. And unfortunately, there are hundreds of these kind of websites out there, and trying to hunt down everyone and individually request that your information be removed would take hours of time. Enter Incogni. So Incogni is a personal data removal service that automatically removes personal information related to you from public websites. And removing this info can help avoid things like spam calls, scammers, and even identity theft. And this is obviously super important for somebody like me who makes YouTube videos for a living, but I wouldn't want my personal info out there regardless. So if you'd like to try Incogni for yourself, they're offering a 60% off discount on their annual plans with my coupon code CraftedWorkshop. And all you need to do to take back control of your personal data is click that link in the video description below and get signed up. Thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to work. So jig number 2 is a pretty versatile one. So I built it for trimming up hardwood edge banding. I personally love using hardwood edge banding on plywood projects. I think it's a lot more durable and nice looking than iron-on edge banding. You can add things like edge profiles like roundovers and chamfers, but trimming up hardwood edge banding can be a little bit tricky. I've typically used a router for this in the past, but it's messy. It's really easy to dig into the face of your plywood. So when I needed to trim up the hardwood edge banding on this coffee table project I'm working on, I wanted to figure out another method. All I needed to do was cut down a strip of plywood roughly equal to the height and length of the table saw fence. Then I drilled a few holes in that piece of plywood for these fence clamps. These are a great way to attach jigs to your table saw fence, but I'll also show another method for doing this a little later in the video. Once that first piece was clamped down, I went ahead and added this taller piece of plywood, and the only thing I needed to keep in mind here is that this piece needed to be spaced up off of the table saw table about ½ an inch or so, and that'll just give clearance for that hardwood edge banding to pass under this taller piece so that the table saw blade can flush trim it. And that was it for the jig construction. So next I needed to set the position of the fence, and this is pretty simple as well. I used a piece of scrap and just ran it along the face of the jig, and I wanted to make sure that table saw blade did not move at all when I was running that piece of scrap across the sled, because if it does move, that means the table saw blade is gonna dig into the surface of your plywood panel, which is obviously not what you want. And once the fence's position was set, I could go ahead and add a feather board just to keep nice even pressure on that plywood panel as it runs across the jig, and get to flush trimming. And so as you can hopefully see, that is pretty much perfect. We'll need to do a tiny bit of sanding, but that looks really good. And the advantage of doing it on the table saw is that you generate a heck of a lot less dust than you do with the router. So this setup obviously works great for flush trimming, but can be used for a lot of other things as well. Let's say you wanted to cut a raised panel at the table saw. It would be as easy as setting your table saw blade to an angle, using some sort of push block, and then just running your piece across the blade. You could also add some T-track here and use this to apply downward pressure with feather boards. Really, this is a pretty versatile setup, and I think you could add all kinds of accessories to make it even more useful. So I think that covers jig number 2, so let's move on to jig number 3. So one of the biggest weaknesses on these smaller job site saws is the lack of infeed and outfeed support, because the table of the saw is so small. And compared to my larger cabinet saw, the infeed distance between the blade and the front edge of the table is only about 6 or 7 inches, which really is not much.
That's what she said.
As you'll know if you've worked with these kind of saws, if you're trying to wrestle a larger panel, a longer board across a table saw like this, it can be really tricky to get your piece securely up against the fence before the piece starts getting cut by the table saw blade. So thankfully there is a very simple solution to this. So this is an extension fence, and it's a really simple little add-on to your table saw fence. And there are commercially available versions of this extension fence, but they are extremely expensive for what they are. This was built for free out of scraps I had lying around my shop. So I already had a chunk of 2 layers of 3/4 inch plywood glued together. This was an offcut from my lift top assembly table, and this is a prime example of why I'm a scrap hoarder, because I knew that this double layered piece of plywood would come in handy one day, and it only took about a year for that to be the case. But then I knew I wanted the overall thickness of this extension to be a nice round number. And unfortunately, 2 layers of 3/4 inch plywood isn't actually 1.5 inches. It's a little bit below 1.5 inches. So to solve that, I went ahead and glued on another piece of 3/4 inch plywood. And once the glue dried, I went ahead and planed this whole assembly down to exactly 2 inches. Now, if you don't have a planer, you could definitely resaw this to 2 inches as well with the table saw, but I figured it'd be a lot easier to get this to a very accurate thickness with the planer. I went ahead and moved over to my router table and got a dovetail bit set up so that I could route in a couple dovetail slots on the back side of this fence, so I could use these match fit clamps to attach the extension to my table saw fence. And then I just ran the extension across the bit 3 times to get 3 slots to attach this to my table saw fence. Once those slots were routed out, I could get the whole thing attached to my table saw fence with those match fit clamps. And I personally think this is a really cool system. This is not sponsored or anything, but I'm definitely going to be using these on more jigs in the future. Anyway, the next thing I needed to add was this little support piece. So one thing I needed to consider on this particular table saw is that the fence adjustment is actually on the top of the fence. So I wanted to make sure this clamp wasn't going to be in the way there. And once I got that location dialed in, I went ahead and clamped my little support in place and then attached it with more screws, again, pre-drilling and countersinking the holes. And that was pretty much it to build the extension. So now I could test it out comparing the same cut without the extension and with the extension. And as you can see, it's definitely doable to cut larger panels like this, even without some sort of in-feed support. But keep in mind that this was only 1/2 inch plywood. This gets a lot more difficult the heavier your piece is. And now if we compare that to making the same cut with the extension installed, I think you'll see how much easier it was to get that piece lined up, secure against the fence before starting cutting. It just made the whole process so much simpler. And the nice thing about this setup is I can also use it on my larger cabinet saw fence. And so if I'm ripping longer pieces over there, I can also have in-feed support. So I think that covers jig number 3. Let's go ahead and move on to jig number 4. Whew. So as I mentioned, I've been working on this coffee table project as part of my new beginner woodworking course, Jumpstart Your Woodworking. And so as you'll know, if you saw my last video about the workbench I built for that course, I built everything in this course with a very limited tool set so that you guys could follow along at home. And that meant I didn't have access to all my fancy cabinet saw jigs, so I needed to figure out a simple way to cut the tapers on these legs. And you could definitely build a more complicated tapering and jointing jig like this, but I decided to show a very simple version of this jig. And I think it's a great option, especially if you build the same project over and over again, maybe for a business or craft shows or whatever. So let me show you the jig. So just for point of reference, these were the legs for the coffee table. As you can see, they have angled half laps cut in. So you might think all of that would make it a little tricky to cut the tapers on the legs, but it was really, really simple. So this is the jig. As you can see, just a piece of scrap plywood, 1/2-inch plywood in this case, and then some more scraps. These are actually the offcuts from these legs. And all I did was set my leg in place, and I basically just lined up my layout lines with the edge of this piece of plywood because I knew that's exactly where it'd be getting cut. And then I just glued these pieces of scrap in place, one to support the long edge of the leg and one to support the back edge. And by having both of these pieces in place, you can see that the leg is really nice and secure in this jig. It's really not going anywhere. A lot of these jigs have some sort of clamp or T-track built in, but in my case, all I did was hold it down with the same push blocks I use on my jointer. And the other difference you might notice with this jig and my other tapering jig is that there's no runner or miter bar on the back. And that's because all you really need to do is keep pressure up against the fence like you do any other time you cut on the table saw, and you end up with a very accurate, precisely cut taper that you can repeat over and over again on as many legs as you want. And so you might be thinking that there's no adjustability in a jig like this, but actually the taper ended up a little bit narrower than I wanted on the first leg. And all I had to do to adjust the exact size of that taper was bump my fence over to the right a little bit, and it would make the taper wider. And so I just wanted to show this jig because I think there's a tendency, especially on YouTube, to make jigs that are incredibly over-engineered. They take tons of time to build. And while they might have a ton of adjustability built in, I think depending on your use cases, building these one-off jigs can actually be pretty handy, especially if, as I mentioned earlier, you build the same thing over and over again. And I know a lot of production shops, you'll see a wall full of jigs that are one-off jigs, because by making them one-off, there is no setup process. They know they can just go back to the tool, make the cut, make the piece with no messing about, because having to do all of that setup every time you build something can really be a major time sink. One other slight downfall of making everything adjustable is that anywhere it's adjustable is a place where it can go out of adjustment. So maybe you didn't screw down that T-track clamp tight enough or whatever. That means your jig could shift mid-project if you drop it on the floor. Whereas this thing, I'm pretty sure I could run over it with my car and it would still be exactly accurate. So hopefully one or even all of these jigs will be helpful on some of your future woodworking projects. I think it's very easy to fall into the mental trap thinking that you can't build whatever project you want with more limited tools, and I would argue that you really just need to be a little bit more resourceful. These smaller job site saws are super capable. My first table saw was very similar to this, and I built a heck of a lot of projects with that saw before I upgraded to the cabinet saw that I have now. So again, I'll have a downloadable PDF with the dimensions of all these jigs in the video description below, in case you want to check that out. If it's your first time here, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. And until next week, happy building.